Ladies and gentlemen, by the end of this video, you will know everything you need to know about the classical variation within the Caro Kann defense. It rises from the move order e4, c6, d4, d5, and knight c3. The point of the classical variation is that white wants to trade off the pawn, have a knight in the center, and then pretty much prove an advantage in the sense that the c-pawn is very much misplaced and that white is more active. However, I have prepared a weapon today for you guys that will allow us to fight back in a very active and dynamic manner. So there are multiple moves in this position. You know, for a long time, people have played the Tartakower variation. It was very popular at a certain point, but white is almost always able to prove a very sizable advantage, therefore making this a slightly dubious variation in my opinion. There's also the classical line in the classical variation, which is bishop f5, and I do not like this position because of knight g3, bishop g6, and h4, which forces us into a very cramped position. And this is very, very reminiscent of the Mikhail Tal variation in the Caro Kann advanced variation, because after h6 we get met with h5 and we're forced to retreat our bishop. And even though the engine evaluates this as equal, I would say that playing this as a human is very difficult, and comparatively, you will have much greater success playing a more playable variation where you're not as cramped. So the move I recommend here is knight f6, and from there, we're pretty much trying to trade off white's most active piece, and the compensation that white gets for that is that we have to double our pawns. So there's this Brostein-Larsen variation, which a lot of people play at lower ratings. The point is you're going to set up e5 and try to trade off its pawn. However, our pawns are slightly overextended and it's very difficult to protect them. So I would advise against that, unless you're okay with playing with sort of awkward positions. But the move I recommend is e takes f6, and this is the start of the Tartakower variation, which I believe is the most solid and principal way to play against this classical variation. So let's quickly mention some things that could also happen if the knight does not take on f6. For example, knight g3 is very popular as well. Here you want to play h5. The point of h5 is that, just like in the previous variation with the bishop on f5, we're trying to take up as much space and force white into a cramped position. What's funny is that if white just lazily develops the knight, let's say e2, h4 actually traps the knight completely, and you just win the game. So if white chooses to develop other pieces, even like knight f3 for example, we still play h4 and just force white into a cramped position with less space. And we're very happy here because if white chooses to castle kingside, we're going to have the ability to play h3, and we're going to cause a lot of problems on the kingside. So basically our objective is to take up as much space as possible and force white to move these pieces around, wasting tempo and wasting time. If after h5 you get met with h4, we're completely fine here. The move I like here is c5. And pretty much the point is that if white decides to trade this pawn, you're going to take white's queen with check. So you're going to take away white's right to castle. And then you're going to play knight c6. Very calm developing move. And this invites a big mistake. The most natural move here is knight f3, right? But that actually allows us to play knight g4 and attack this f2 pawn. The only way to protect this is with the king or just moving the rook to a different square. And this forces white into a very bad position. Like this right here is already almost -1 for black. So that's a great opening for us. If we start with knight g4 right away, this allows knight h3. And the engine doesn't mind this for white, and I would agree, because then the white can have pretty easy development, even with this knight on the edge of the board, and really easily jump into f4 later on, and then actually apply pressure on this pawn, and just have a lot of central control. So yeah, just develop with knight c6. If knight f3 gets played, knight g4 is your idea. If knight f3 does not get played, and a different move gets played, you can just develop with bishop g4, even give this check. You can play e6, target this pawn, and then you can castle kingside. You can also give this check with rook d8. You're going to be completely fine. Besides knight g3, I can't really think of any other sidelines. I guess there's also bishop d3, but that just hangs a pawn. Now, generally speaking, if there was no pawn on c6, it would allow bishop b5 discovered check, after which we would lose our queen. However, since we have a pawn on c6, there's no way that white can check us, and therefore we're just better here, like we're up an entire free pawn. Now, what if white takes our knight? We're going to recapture with the e-pawn, and now let me tell you guys a little bit about the plans and ideas of this position. So basically, we're trading off our center pawn and doubling our pawn. What this does is it creates a weakness, technically, on our king side. However, when we castle, our king is going to be very safe because this pawn structure is very difficult to access. So in every single Tartakower position, we're always going to be castling kingside, and we're going to be fine. We're going to drop our bishop on d6, and this will allow us to pressure this h2 pawn. It's also going to be the most active square for a bishop because, generally speaking, you're going to see c3 a lot. Then we're going to drop this knight on d7. If there's a bishop on c4, we're going to put a knight on d7 and b6. If the bishop is on d3, let's say, and not in this particular instance, because here the pawn would be hanging, I'm just saying in general, like 5 moves down the line, if the bishop is not on c4, knight d7, and then you're going to play knight f8, or you're going to prepare c5. So c5 is to disrupt the center. Knight f8 is that you can enable knight e6 or knight g6. You're going to play this in a very interesting way and not typical to the Caro Kann, because you're not going to be going for any sort of minority attacks or trying to isolate this pawn. you're going to be trying to checkmate your opponent. So this is a very aggressive variation. If the king castles kingside, h5, h4, h3 is your main idea. If the king does not castle kingside and castles queenside, you're going to play b5, a5, a4, trying to take up as much space and create light square weaknesses. So you're going to play on the light squares, try to create an attack. You can double your rooks, and I'm going to show you guys an example game of how that would look like. Now, white's idea is, white wants to play c3, put a bishop on d3, queen on c2, and take this h7 pawn and attack it. Since we're going to be castling kingside, white is trying to attack our king. White also wants to just get active development and take up as much space as possible and then trade off pieces, because if white is able to trade off all of our pieces, white is going to be a little bit better because of the extra space and just better pawn structure. Therefore, we want to avoid unnecessary trades, try to create attacks, and use our pawns. Now let's look at the actual theory. So here the main move is c3. Most people are going to play knight f3 just because it's more natural. Like when you think of the most natural move in this position, it's knight f3. However, knight f3 allows bishop f5, and bishop f5 prevents the main idea for white, which is bishop d3. So bishop f5, if you run into bishop d3, you're going to trade this bishop off, and you're going to be very happy here. This is the exception for the trades, because you want to trade off white's most active piece. You're going to play bishop d6 next, and you're going to castle, try to give white a check. If white doesn't castle, knight d7, knight f8, c5 if you want to, and you're going to be fine. So if you get knight f3, keep this in mind. You want to play bishop f5 and prevent bishop d3. The bishop has no other good squares. For example, the bishop on c4, once again, will get targeted by this knight on d7 and b6. So an example line of that, let's just say, would be something like this, where I'm just going to show you guys a quick example. I'm playing some very quick moves, but basically this would be your point. You're going to target this bishop, and this bishop has to move back, or if it gets traded, you're going to be better because of the bishop pair, and you're going to cruise into a very comfortable endgame. And no matter what happens, your piece placement is going to be a lot better, and that will be your compensation for this sort of double pawns, and therefore you're going to be quite okay. That covers knight f3. Now let's look at the main move, which is c3. c3, once again, prepares to play bishop d3, and so as to not blunder this pawn. It also just reinforces this d4 pawn, which is very common in the Caro Kann. We're going to play bishop d6, our most active developing move. After bishop d3, we want to castle right away. And after queen c2, we want to play rook e8 check. The reason we start with rook e8 check is because it happens to come with tempo. So if we were to play rook e8 later, down a move where white has already castled, this wouldn't be as effective. But the point is, you're also enabling the move knight d7 to f8, which is a very common idea in these variations, because you either want to place the knight on g6 or e6 in order to pressure this f4 square. The reason you want to pressure this f4 square is to prevent this bishop from coming out here, because it's quite often very annoying to deal with the bishop on f4. And it will also allow us to create very, very strong attacks if we prevent bishop f4. I'm going to show you guys what that will look like very, very shortly. After this knight moves out, you have to protect this pawn now, since it's being targeted by two pieces. We play h5. This move only became popular about 5-6 years ago. Really before that, everybody was playing either g6 or h6, which were very subpar moves because they created weaknesses. h5 is an attacking move. So if white chooses to castle kingside, right away we're just going to continue our attack h4. And if we get the ability to, let's say bishop e3, we're just going to play h3. When we play h3, this position is already very, very dangerous for white. For example, if g3, now we've created this big weakness, we're going to try to place a bishop or a queen on one of these two squares and attack this rook. So right away, we can tell that white is very unhappy in this position, and white has made a big concession. A lot of the time after h4, you're going to end up with something like h3. And what h3 does is it makes g3 a very weakening move. So from there, we can right away play bishop c7 and then place the queen on d6 and try to attack this king with a checkmate threat, since the move in g3 is going to be almost impossible now. However, the problem with queen d6 right away is that his bishop comes out to f4. So once again, like I mentioned earlier, the bishop on f4 is annoying to deal with. That's why after, let's say, just some random moves, I'm going to play whatever the engine suggests here for white. We're going to play knight d7, rook e1, for example, knight f8, and then we're going to play knight e6. The reason we don't play knight g6 in this particular instance is that this bishop would be able to capture and, win a pawn. So we don't want to allow that to happen. But after, for example, knight e6, now whatever white plays, let's say just random move, a3, queen d6 is completely possible. And white is worse here, because white has to make a lot of concessions to be able to deal with this. So f4 is the engine stop choice for white here. And actually, our top response is g5. If the pawn captures, we have this attack, and then we're going to capture this pawn. And good luck defending all of this with all of these sort of infiltration tactics that we eventually have. It's going to be very difficult for white to stay in this game. That should cover everything to do with h5. There's also, I guess, instead of castling, white can just play h4 right away. We're going to play knight d7, castles, once again, knight f6, and then you have knight e6, knight g6, ideas, and then you also want to play c5 eventually to disrupt the center. That should cover everything to do with castling after the move h5. Just to recap really quickly, you're going to want to place a bishop on c7. Well, first of all, you want to push this pawn, but then you also want to place a bishop on c7, queen on d6, prevent this bishop from coming out to f4 since there's a knight currently protecting that square. You always have the ability to play g5, which seems to be very weakening. However, it doesn't really matter if your king is weak if you threaten checkmate. Keep all of that in mind. This position is very dynamic. It's one of the rare cases where black is actually the attacking side. So remember those ideas and you're going to have a lot of fun implementing them. Now it's time to look at what happens if white decides to castle queenside, which is a big possibility and actually probably white's slightly safer option. So if white develops the bishop, we develop our knight, white castles. Now our attack is on b5, a5, and a4. So we want to take up as much space as possible. We want to sort of neutralize this light square bishop, and then we want to create attacks using the light squares and the light square weaknesses we can create. This position isn't very popular because white struggles to protect his king, and there isn't a lot of theory in this position. So I'm going to show you guys an example game that was played last year between a 2300. This will just showcase how you can attack properly in this sort of position. So we get b5, the knight comes out. Here the knight is threatening the pawn, and if we push to h4, this pawn becomes a target. Pawn on h4 isn't posing any threats since the king is castled queenside. So this trade occurs. We get knight b6, bringing more resources onto the queenside. h4, a5. This rook comes out to e1. We don't want to trade it because then white would control the file. So bishop e6 gets played in the game. We get f3 with the point of reinforcing this e4 square. Players end up just shuffling pieces for a couple of moves. King moves over, and white didn't make any sort of significant mistakes in this game. Black ended up just playing more accurately and displayed a great understanding in this position. And even at the 2300 level, you can see how quickly players fall apart. a3 gets played from white. This creates more weaknesses along the light squares, but it's necessary to prevent a3 from black's perspective because that would create even more weaknesses and it would force white into a very, very losing position thanks to black's attack. So a3 is pretty much necessary. We get rook e7, this time trying to double the rooks, apply more pressure on this file, trying to take control of it. Queen d1 gets played. I'm just going to skim through these moves a little bit now. A couple of trades occur. Now this knight jumps to f4, attacking this bishop, and now we can see that this pawn is also hanging. We get a couple of moves down. White takes this pawn as compensation. However, this pawn is not worth the same as a e4 pawn because now black controls this file. Black is the one leading the attack. Queen e6, rook d1, rook d2. The rook on the second file is very strong, and white's attack has diminished in the sense that white has no threats in this position. For example, there are no apparent checks that white can play, and this queen is sort of misplaced because, well, it's not posing any threats. We get d5 as a desperation attempt, and after which this check gets played, and then queen f2. And after queen f2, there's really no way to defend against this knight h3. White resigned because this mate is forced. For example, if this knight gets captured, this is mate in 1. I think this is a beautiful example of how this player was able to use these pawns to force white into a passive position, which allowed him to create this sort of attack with doubling the rooks on the e file and just playing a very beautiful game. This sums up the classical variation of the Caro Kann. If you guys found this video useful, please consider checking out the video to my left. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in a different video.